The chandeliers glittered like frozen constellations above the Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd of New York's elite. Women in silk gowns and diamonds floated between marble columns like swans, while men in tuxedos traded handshakes, business cards, and carefully rehearsed charm. A live orchestra played soft jazz in the background, every note polished, effortless, expensive. Camellia Baker pressed her clutch against her side and took a deep breath, forcing herself to smile. This was her chance. The charity gala hosted by the Harrington Foundation was not just a social event, it was the kind of gathering where careers were made and futures could shift with a single introduction. As a young interior designer trying to rebuild her reputation after a devastating breakup, she knew she couldn't afford to blend into the wallpaper tonight. She scanned the crowd, rehearsing her mental checklist, approach potential clients, introduce herself to at least 3 developers, leave before midnight, keep it professional, keep it graceful. Then she saw him, Matthew Cole. The name alone was enough to make her stomach tighten. He was laughing near the champagne bar, his familiar profile slicing through the crowd like a bad memory she hadn't invited. His hand rested casually on the arm of the woman who used to be Camelia's assistant, the woman he'd cheated with. Her pulse spiked. She hadn't seen Matthew in almost a year, not since she'd walked out of their engagement with nothing but her dignity and her portfolio. She had thought she was ready for anything tonight, but she wasn't ready for this. Not for his smile, polished and insincere, as if nothing had happened. Not for the way his eyes caught hers across the ballroom. He started walking toward her. No, not now.
Not here. Camelia's gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape, a distraction, anything.
Her heel wobbled slightly against the polished floor as panic brushed the edges of her composure. She refused to let him see her flinch. She refused to give him the satisfaction. And then she saw him. A man stood just a few feet away, tall and sharply dressed in a midnight black tuxedo, his posture commanding but not loud. His presence seemed to quiet the air around him. Dark hair brushed back neatly, strong jawline, eyes like cool steel observing the crowd with detached precision. He didn't seem to belong to anyone's group. People noticed him but kept their distance, as if they sensed something formidable. Before she could second-guess herself, Camellia crossed the distance between them and lightly grabbed his arm. "Please."
"Just go with it," she whispered, her voice soft but desperate. The man turned to her, one eyebrow arching slightly.
His eyes flicked toward Matthew, who was now only a few steps away, then back to her. A brief, unreadable pause, and then, without hesitation, he slipped his hand around her waist as if they'd walked in together. "Darling," he said smoothly, his voice low and steady, perfectly timed. "There you are." "I was starting to wonder if you'd abandoned me for the dessert table." Camellia forced a laugh, surprised at how natural it sounded. "You know me."
"I can't resist the macarons." Matthew stopped short, clearly not expecting this.
His confident smile faltered just slightly. "Oh," he said, looking between them.
"I didn't realize you were with someone." The stranger's grip on her waist tightened just enough to steady her, not to control.
"You didn't?" he replied, his tone polite but edged with quiet authority.
"And who might you be?"
"Matthew Cole," Matthew said, straightening his jacket. "An old friend." "Ah," the man said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
"Old being the key word." Camellia almost choked on a laugh.
Matthew's jaw ticked, but he covered it quickly. After a few more awkward pleasantries, he muttered something about catching up later and retreated, his fiancée trailing after him. As soon as he disappeared into the crowd, Camellia exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
"Oh my God," she murmured. "I can't believe I just did that. The man turned to her fully now, releasing her waist but not stepping back.
Up close, he was even more striking. There was an elegance in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that made the noise of the ballroom fade a little. "You're surprisingly convincing," he said.
I was almost convinced myself, Camellia flushed. I'm so sorry.
That was completely out of line.
I panicked.
"My ex-fiancée, well, you saw." "I did," he said simply. His gaze lingered on her, not invasive but curious. "You handled it well?" She gave a nervous laugh. "With the help of a very kind stranger." "Delvin?" he offered, extending his hand. Delvin Reed. The name struck her like a quiet bell. She knew that name. Everyone in New York's design and development circles knew that name. Reed Enterprises wasn't just a company. It was a powerhouse behind some of the city's most ambitious architectural projects. She shook his hand, hoping he couldn't feel the sudden nerves in her grip. "Camellia Baker, and thank you, Mr. Reed, for saving me from a very awkward conversation." "Delvin," he corrected with a small, knowing smile. "And it looked like you could use a partner in crime." Her laugh was genuine this time, light and warm. Around them the music swelled, couples began to move toward the dance floor. For a brief, unexpected moment, it felt like the rest of the ballroom blurred away, just the two of them standing under the golden chandeliers, strangers bound by an improvised story that suddenly didn't feel so far-fetched. Camellia didn't know it yet, but that impulsive decision to grab a stranger's arm would change the course of her life. Camellia walked out of the Waldorf Astoria hours later with aching feet and a head buzzing with adrenaline she couldn't quite shake. The night air was crisp, the kind that carried the faint smell of rain and city smoke. She paused on the marble steps, clutching her wrap around her shoulders, replaying the evening in her head over and over. It should have been a simple night. Smile, network, hand out business cards. Instead, it had turned into something out of a romantic comedy, except the stranger she'd grabbed wasn't just anyone. Delvin Reed. She had spent the cab ride home scrolling through articles on her phone, staring at his face splashed across headlines. Reed Enterprises plans, landmark urban renewal project. Delvin Reed, the billionaire visionary behind New York's future. And there she had been, clinging to his arm like a damsel in distress. Camellia pressed her lips together, equal parts mortified and intrigued. She couldn't forget the weight of his steady hand on her waist, the way he'd effortlessly taken control of the situation without making her feel small, or the way his eyes had lingered on her afterward, not as a businessman sizing up a deal, but as someone genuinely curious. She shook her head, forcing herself to stop. Get a grip, Camellia. He was a powerful CEO. She was an independent designer still fighting to rebuild her reputation after Matthew's betrayal. Men like Delvin lived in penthouses above clouds. Women like her renovated cramped apartments and prayed invoices got paid on time. Still, it had felt like something shifted when their eyes met under the chandelier. The next morning, her phone buzzed as she was sketching at her studio, a cozy space tucked into a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn. The walls were lined with sample boards, fabric swatches, and architectural models. The hum of the city outside mixed with the faint sound of jazz from the old radio she kept on the windowsill. She glanced at the screen.
An unfamiliar number. Hello?
"Ms. Baker?" "Good morning," a polished female voice came through. "I'm calling on behalf of Reed Enterprises. Mr. Reed's development team was impressed by your previous work, and we'd like to invite you to present your design vision for the Harrington project." Camellia froze, pencil suspended in midair.
I'm sorry, did you say the Harrington project?
"Yes, ma'am. It's one of our upcoming flagship developments. We're inviting a small number of designers to pitch next week. Your work on the Midtown renovation was recommended by one of our consultants." Her heart thudded in her chest. Harrington was the project every designer dreamed of landing, a luxury mixed-use complex in the heart of Manhattan.
Rumored to have a budget that could transform careers overnight. I'd be honored, she managed. Excellent.
The presentation will be at Reed Enterprises headquarters, Thursday, 10 a.m. sharp. After the call ended, Camelia stared at the sunlight hitting her drafting table, almost suspicious that the universe was playing a trick on her. Out of all the firms in the city, out of all the people she could have bumped into at that gala, Delvin Reed. She had no idea if he'd had anything to do with the invitation, but the thought made her pulse quicken. Not with romantic giddiness, at least that's what she told herself, but with determination. This was her shot. Thursday arrived faster than she'd expected. She spent every spare hour refining her concept, a balance of contemporary elegance and warm,
livable design, a direct contrast to the cold,
impersonal spaces that often dominated New York's luxury market. That morning, she stood in front of the mirrored doors of Reed Enterprises headquarters, a sleek tower of glass and steel that reflected the city like a perfectly polished mirror, a place where power hummed beneath the marble floors. Her heels clicked softly as she stepped into the lobby. The reception area was minimalist yet grand, with black granite floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Midtown. Everything was quiet, precise, no wasted movement, no misplaced detail. She checked in, rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, and tried to steady her breathing. This was business. She had worked for years to prove herself. Tonight's impulsive encounter at a charity gala had nothing to do with this opportunity. But when the double doors of the boardroom opened, her practiced composure wavered. Delvin Reed sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by senior executives and architects. His presence commanded the room effortlessly, even though he wasn't saying anything. His suit was perfectly tailored, his gaze calm and analytical as he flipped through briefing papers. When his eyes lifted and found hers, something flickered across his expression, recognition, amusement, maybe a trace of curiosity. Camelia's throat tightened. For a split second, the ballroom came rushing back. The chandeliers, his hand on her waist, Matthew's stunned expression. But she straightened her blazer, walked forward, and extended her hand. "Mr. Reed," she greeted, professional and clear. "Ms. Baker," he replied, rising to shake her hand. There was the faintest hint of a smile in his eyes, subtle enough that no one else would notice. "Good to see you again, in a more official setting." A few executives exchanged glances, sensing something but unsure what. Camelia forced a calm smile. Likewise, she took her place at the front of the room, setting up her presentation. Her palms were damp, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. She talked about spatial flow, natural light, the emotional impact of interior environments. She showed sketches, mood boards, and a scaled 3D model she'd spent nights perfecting. Slowly, the room shifted. Board members leaned forward, executives nodded, questions turned from polite to genuinely engaged. And through it all, Delvin listened. Not as a distracted CEO waiting for his turn to speak, but intently. His gaze was focused, thoughtful. It unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. When she concluded, the room erupted in soft murmurs of approval. One of the senior architects leaned toward Delvin. "She's the most compelling we've heard." Delvin's response was measured, but there was a spark in his tone. "Agreed." As the meeting wrapped up, one of the coordinators told her they'd be in touch soon. Camelia gathered her materials, her heart pounding. She turned toward the door just as Delvin approached her, hands casually in his pockets. "Well," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You certainly made an impression." She met his eyes, steadier this time.
I hope it was a professional one. His smile was brief but unmistakable.
"That too." And just like that, he walked back toward his team,
leaving her standing there, caught between the rush of triumph and the unsettling awareness that their story wasn't going to end at a gala handshake.
Camellia left the boardroom with a steady, relieved breath. The sunlight through Reed Enterprises' windows felt like a quiet applause, clean, decisive. People who had once skimmed her resume now asked about materials and light studies, leaning in to see the sketches spread on the table. Delvin observed from the head of the table, his face an unreadable mask that softened only when he rose and walked toward her. He moved with the calm reserve of someone used to making decisions that reshaped skylines. "Ms. Baker," he said, extending a hand. "You made a persuasive case." "Thank you," she replied, keeping her voice professional. "I focused on human-scale interventions. Harrington should feel inhabited. That's the language we need." He tapped his tablet, bringing up one of her slides.
Mrs. Ellison asked about aging.
"Your approach addressed that. Natural finishes, that patina, rather than artificial veneers that show wear. Camellia offered specifics, sourcing, maintenance protocols, life cycle costs, answers born of nights spent refining details. She felt a steady pride bloom. These were not vague ideas, but disciplined solutions. Delvin nodded. "We need stewardship, not spectacle." He beckoned her into a glass-walled conference room. "Let's talk next steps." Inside, the city felt suspended. They worked through schedules, budgets, and the communal spaces she envisioned. An atrium that invited neighbors in, a small library that felt like a living room, terraces softened with plantings. Delvin's questions were precise: light angles, sightlines, how families might gather in shared courtyards. He listened with the close attention of someone who measured not just cost, but consequence. By the end of the hour, they had a framework. Reed Enterprises would bring Camellia on as lead interior designer for the Harringtons' residential and public spaces, pending final board approval. The offer felt like a threshold, a validation that rearranged career possibilities. Formalities followed: non-disclosure agreements, timelines, an initial retainer. In an email the next day, Delvin suggested a site walk. "I like to be on the ground," he wrote. "It keeps decisions honest." Camellia welcomed the change. A site walk meant boots instead of heels, measuring tapes instead of champagne flutes. It meant the messy, tactile work where sketches met concrete and mistakes demanded immediate, practical fixes. She liked that it forced collaboration in real, physical terms. Over the weeks, their professional rhythm took shape. Early meetings stretched into afternoons at drawing boards. They debated plant palettes with horticulturalists and argued about the subtle engineering of banisters so a child's hand would find comfort, not danger. Delvin's team moved with efficient focus. Camellia began to see threads of his thinking in the plans and notes they shared. Small exchanges revealed more than formal correspondence ever could. He left comments on a shared document with an observation about a light fixture's angle. She sent a photograph of a bench prototype with the caption, "Sits well, test with kids." He brought reference books to a lunch meeting, annotated and dog-eared. "I like to read footnotes," he told her. "They tell you what people apologize for later." They started to protect each other's ideas in front of the board. When a senior member questioned a sustainable materials cost, Delvin intervened with firm, quiet insistence, pointing to life cycle savings and long-term value. Those moments mattered to Camellia. In a room where reputations and contracts could be negotiated with a look, his defense felt like more than corporate politics. It felt like advocacy. Their conversation sometimes drifted beyond specifics. On a rainy afternoon after a long site inspection, Delvin offered to drive her back to Brooklyn. The car hummed along wet streets while she spoke about her studio's beginnings and the stubborn early projects that taught her to be resourceful. He listened as if each story were a piece of evidence, not gossip. He catalogued details, asked a careful question.
"Noted an anecdote. I admire that you started in the workshop," he said, as they pulled up to her building.
"There's a humility to that." "It's how you learn the rules before you break them," she answered. He smiled. A small, genuine curve that didn't require the room's light to sell it. Exactly. Trust accrued in small measures, a meeting that wrapped early because everyone was on the same page, a materials supplier who delivered ahead of schedule, a mock-up that passed inspection. They celebrated quietly, a coffee that felt like a toast, a late-night sandwich over blueprints, rather than the bodyguards and champagne milestones she had once imagined success required. Camellia noticed too how Delvin listened to people who didn't have power, vendors, young architects, site foremen. He greeted them with a directness that made them bristle, then relax. Those observations mattered to her. They suggested a leader who understood that the city's architecture was only as humane as the people who built it. One evening, after the plaster samples had been approved and the logistics finally balanced, he walked her to her car. Street lamps painted amber pools along the sidewalk. "You did good work today," he said simply. "You were involved," she countered, smiling. "I prefer to know who builds the things my company takes responsibility for," he replied. "It keeps us accountable." She felt the truth of that answer, about him and maybe about herself. It was still early, lines of contract and public scrutiny waited, and there was nothing sentimental about timetables and budgets. But something had shifted. The professional respect between them had softened around the edges, leaving room for a quieter curiosity. Camellia allowed herself a cautious optimism. The Harrington would be her largest project yet, and for the first time in a long while, she could imagine a future not defined by loss. One Friday, after a long week that finally balanced budgets and approved the atrium glazing, Delvin gathered the core team in the glass-walled conference room for a quick toast. He raised his cup, acknowledging each person's piece in the work. When his eyes met Camelia's, there was an unspoken gratitude, a professional recognition that felt unexpectedly personal. The Harrington site buzzed with a rhythm that had become oddly familiar to Camellia. The clang of scaffolding, the murmur of teams discussing measurements, the occasional echo of laughter from crews taking their coffee break, it all layered into a kind of music she had grown to love. She walked across the unfinished atrium with a roll of drawings tucked under her arm, boots crunching over protective mats, hair tied up in a neat twist that couldn't quite contain the loose strands the wind insisted on tugging free. Delvin was already there. He stood by the skeletal framework of the glass wall, sleeves rolled up, dress shirt creased at the elbows, his attention fixed on a structural engineer pointing at a diagram. Even in that half-constructed space, his presence anchored the room. He didn't bark orders. He listened, leaned in, asked precise questions. The crews respected him because he respected their expertise. When he noticed her, a small shift crossed his expression, something between a nod of acknowledgement and the ghost of a smile. It wasn't flirtatious. It was something steadier, more grounded, a silent "you're here" that made the cold morning feel less biting. "Morning," she said, joining him near the plans table. "Morning," he returned, glancing at her roll of drawings. "New revisions?" "Just refinements," she replied. "We adjusted the library's west-facing windows to maximize the afternoon light without overheating the interior.
And I've reworked the built-in seating, more informal, like a nook, people can claim." He motioned for her to spread the drawings out.
As she talked him through the details, she noticed how closely he listened, not just to approve, but to understand. Their conversations had started to flow with an ease that surprised her. Technical discussions dissolved into shared ideas, small jokes, moments of honest disagreement that sharpened the design instead of bruising egos. Later that day, over a quick lunch on the terrace of a nearby cafe, Camellia found herself talking about things she hadn't expected to share. Not strategic career plans or polished anecdotes, but small personal fragments, the old drafting table she'd inherited from her grandfather. The night she almost quit, after a client dismissed her as too young to lead, the thrill of seeing one of her early projects fully built for the first time. Delvin listened with that same unhurried focus. He asked thoughtful questions, not to pry, but to understand what shaped her. Occasionally, his dry humor surfaced, unexpected, understated, and all the more disarming for it. "And yet here you are," he said, sipping his coffee, "leading one of the city's most ambitious redevelopment projects." She gave a soft laugh. "Still feels surreal, to be honest." He tilted his head. "I think that's what keeps good designers grounded, the inability to believe their work is inevitable." The conversation lingered long after their plates were cleared. She caught herself studying the way the late autumn light framed his profile, the sharp jawline, the faint crease near his eyes when he smiled. She quickly looked away, chiding herself. This was work. He was her client. But beneath that professional boundary, something quieter had begun to settle. A warmth, a mutual respect that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, shading into something deeper. Over the next few weeks, their schedules seemed to align more often than coincidence would suggest. Site inspections bled into late afternoon strategy meetings, which sometimes stretched into shared dinners in quiet midtown restaurants. There was nothing overtly romantic in these encounters, no candlelight confessions, no deliberate flirtation. But there was a growing comfort, a sense of ease that neither of them bothered to label. One evening, after a particularly long day resolving an issue with the atrium glazing, Delvin offered her a ride again. The sky had darkened early, the city streets slick from an unexpected drizzle. Inside the warm car, with the city unfolding through rain-streaked windows, their conversation shifted to lighter things, books, music, the oddities of growing up in small towns versus urban jungles. "I used to collect postcards," Camellia admitted, embarrassed.
Every place I couldn't visit, I'd buy a postcard of.
"It felt like proof that the world was bigger than my little corner." "Do you still have them?" he asked. "Boxed up somewhere. Probably gathering dust. You should frame them," he said simply. "They're evidence of who you were and why you became who you are." His words struck her more deeply than she expected. She turned toward him, but his attention was on the road, hands steady on the wheel. He hadn't meant it as a grand statement, but it felt like one anyway. By the time they reached her building, she hesitated before opening the door. "Thanks for the ride," she said. "Any time," he replied, his gaze meeting hers briefly. Steady, unhurried. There was something in that look, something neither of them named. As winter crept closer, the Harrington structure rose steadily, and so did the unspoken connection between them. It wasn't a blaze. It was a slow, quiet build, the kind that didn't demand attention but was impossible to ignore. Camellia found herself anticipating their meetings, catching herself smiling at his dry comments in presentations, noticing the way his hand brushed hers occasionally when they reached for the same sketch. She told herself to stay focused, career first. But deep down, she knew something had shifted, and Delvin, for all his composed exterior, began to linger a little longer at the end of meetings, to ask about her weekends, to offer quiet, thoughtful gestures, a coffee on cold mornings, an umbrella when the forecast lied. For a man known for his distance, these small acts spoke volumes. Neither of them said the word, but it was there, taking root between scaffolding and skylines, in shared coffees and unguarded conversations, the beginning of something neither had planned for. By early December, the Harrington site transformed from a shell into something tangible. Walls that once echoed with the sound of drills now reflected the beginnings of spaces Camellia had only ever seen on paper. The atrium's glass panels were finally in place, catching winter light and scattering it across the polished stone floors like spilled champagne. For Camellia, it was a season of relentless deadlines, but also of quiet exhilaration. Each beam, tile, and fixture was proof that her vision was taking shape. Delvin's presence had become woven into the fabric of her days. He wasn't just the powerful CEO overseeing the project. He had become a constant, steady figure, someone she instinctively turned to when a decision needed weighing or when fatigue threatened to dull her edge. Their professional partnership was seamless, but beneath that surface, an undercurrent hummed. A growing connection neither of them voiced, but both felt. One Thursday evening, a winter storm rolled into the city earlier than forecasted. Snow swirled outside the conference room windows as Camellia and Delvin reviewed the final lighting layouts. The building was nearly empty, most staff dismissed early, but the two of them stayed behind to meet the contractor's deadline. She rubbed her temples, scanning the plans under the soft glow of the overhead lights. If we shift the pendant lights 3 feet closer to the balcony, we'll lose the shadow pooling at the center of the atrium, she murmured. Delvin leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You're right," he said quietly. "The light pattern would flatten. It's subtle, but it changes the entire character of the space." His voice was low, thoughtful. She glanced sideways and caught his expression, focused, intent, a few strands of dark hair falling onto his forehead. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of the storm outside and the two of them leaning over blueprints like co-conspirators. "Coffee?" he asked, suddenly stepping back. "I'll make us both one." "You look like you've been staring at those lines for hours," she laughed softly. "I have been. I won't say no," he returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs, real ceramic ones, not the usual paper cups. She took hers gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. As snow blanketed the city, the office felt strangely intimate, quiet, removed from the chaos beyond the glass walls, he said, settling across from her. "Most designers I've worked with by this stage are either exhausted or ready to compromise on their vision. You're neither?" She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he replied, his mouth curving faintly. "A compliment too, if you want it." She shook her head, smiling. "I've fought too hard to get here to let fatigue make the decisions." "That's what I like about you," he said, almost absently. The words hung between them. Simple, unadorned. But they carried weight. Camellia felt a pulse skip in her chest. She looked down at her coffee, pretending to focus on the steam curling up. But inside, something warm and dangerous was beginning to unfurl. They worked a little longer, side by side, until the city outside quieted into that rare winter hush. When they finally packed up, it was close to midnight. Delvin insisted on driving her home. "I'm not letting you hunt for a cab in a blizzard," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. The car slid through snow-dusted streets, headlights carving golden tunnels through the storm. Camellia watched the world blur past, wrapped in a quiet that felt fragile and safe. At a red light, she turned toward him. His face, illuminated by the dashboard glow, was softer than usual. "Less CEO, more man. Do you ever stop?" she asked suddenly. He glanced at her, amused.
"Stop what? Carrying the weight of—"
"Everything." His hands tightened subtly on the wheel. "No," he said after a moment. "If I stop, things fall through the cracks. People rely on me to keep it together." She studied him, not the polished image, but the man beneath it.
"And who do you rely on?"
His gaze flicked toward her, brief but intense.
"No one," he said quietly. "Not usually." Something in that honesty hit her unexpectedly hard.
She didn't answer. She just sat there, feeling the warmth of the car and the gravity of the moment settle between them like a shared secret. When they arrived at her building, the snow was still falling thick. She hesitated with her hand on the door.
"Oh, thanks," she said softly. "For the ride, for tonight." "Anytime," he replied.
His eyes held hers a beat too long. She felt that pull again, the quiet, magnetic draw she'd been trying not to name. "Good night." "Delvin," she murmured. "Good night, Camellia." She stepped out into the snow.
Heart hammering, the city muffled around her.
When she looked back, his car was still there, idling for a moment longer before disappearing down the street. In the days that followed, Their interactions began to carry subtle, charged pauses, a shared glance in a meeting that lingered a heartbeat too long, a brush of hands as they passed a rolled-up drawing.
Inside jokes no one else caught.
To an outsider, it was still professional. But to them, something had changed. One evening, after a major inspection was completed successfully, Delvin invited the core team for drinks at a small, upscale lounge near Bryant Park. The others filtered out early, leaving just the two of them in a corner booth. The city's glow spilling through frosted windows. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, swirling the last of her wine. "Miss what?" "Not being Delvin Reed, the man who runs everything. The one everyone watches." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Sometimes. But it's been so long, I'm not sure I remember who that was." "Maybe he's still in there," she said softly. Their eyes met across the table. No blueprint between them.
No contracts.
Just two people suspended in a quiet moment neither had planned for. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers lightly. It wasn't deliberate or bold, just a touch, a quiet acknowledgement of everything unspoken between them. She didn't pull away. Outside, the snow had stopped. Inside, something had undeniably begun. The week leading up to Christmas was a blur of deadlines and twinkling lights. Midtown buzzed with holiday energy, storefronts dressed in gold and crimson, wreaths hung from skyscraper doors, and the crisp air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts. At the Harrington site, the atrium was finally complete. Camellia stood on the mezzanine, watching the chandeliers blaze to life for the first time. The light poured over the marble floors like liquid fire, bouncing off the glass walls and filling the space with quiet grandeur. She felt proud. This was hers. Every late night, every sleepless weekend, every stubborn design decision, this was the result. "Not bad," a familiar voice drawled behind her. Her heart stuttered. She turned sharply. "Matthew." He stood at the far end of the mezzanine, hands tucked into the pockets of a tailored camel coat, snow still dusting his shoulders. His smile was exactly as she remembered, confident, disarming, dangerous. It had been almost 2 years since she'd seen him in person, and yet, in an instant, her body remembered everything. The warmth, the heartbreak, the quiet ache that had taken months to bury. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. "I heard the Harrington project was opening up early for inspection. Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about." His eyes swept the atrium. "Impressive. You've done well, Cam." Only he ever called her that. She crossed her arms, a defensive reflex. "You don't belong here." "Maybe not," he said lightly. "But last I checked, public spaces don't require an invitation." She exhaled through her nose. "Why now, Matthew?"
After everything, why show up here?
He tilted his head, studying her with a kind of practiced charm.
Because I wanted to see you.
And because I might have some business interests in the redevelopment group. Small world, huh?
Her stomach tightened.
"You're working with Delvin?" "I'm negotiating with him," Matthew corrected. "Or at least with his acquisition team. My firm's investing in several commercial expansions in Midtown. Turns out Reed Holdings is in the middle of buying one of my properties." It felt like the floor shifted beneath her feet. She'd built a fragile rhythm these past months. Her work, her slow-growing bond with Delvin, her carefully controlled heart. And suddenly, Matthew had stepped right into the center of it, like a match near dry tinder. Before she could reply, a familiar voice echoed from below. "Camellia?" Delvin was standing in the atrium looking up. His dark overcoat framed him like a shadow against the golden light. His gaze shifted between her and Matthew, sharp and assessing. She swallowed. "Delvin, this is—" "Matthew Cross," Matthew finished smoothly, descending the stairs before she could stop him. He extended a hand. "We've met through intermediaries. Good to finally meet in person." Delvin took his hand, but his eyes didn't leave Matthew's face. "Likewise." The handshake lasted a fraction too long, neither willing to yield first. The air was tight, charged. I was just admiring your project, Matthew said. Cam's done a remarkable job. Delvin's gaze flicked to her briefly. She has. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a silent measuring, a subtle staking of territory. Camellia felt like the axis around which the tension spun, though neither of them said it aloud. Matthew was just leaving, she said firmly. Matthew smiled, unfazed. Was I? I thought maybe we could catch up, Cam. Old times, remember? Delvin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Camellia has a meeting with the lighting consultants, he said evenly. I suggest you reschedule your nostalgia. Matthew's brows lifted, amused. Protective, aren't we? Camellia stepped in quickly. Enough. Matthew, I'll call you if there's anything to talk about. Right now, I have work. He looked at her for a long moment, too long, before nodding. Of course. Don't be a stranger, Cam. He turned, his coat swirling behind him as he disappeared down the stairs. The silence that followed was sharp. Delvin looked at her. Matthew cross. She rubbed her forehead. I didn't know he was involved with your acquisition team. You dated him, Delvin said. Not a question. His voice was calm, but beneath it, something harder lurked. Yes, she admitted quietly. A long time ago, his eyes narrowed slightly. And now he's suddenly showing up here? She met his gaze, refusing to flinch. I didn't invite him.
I didn't even know he was coming, Delvin exhaled, looking away for a second.
He's not just anyone, Camellia. His firm is aggressive. They're known for leveraging personal relationships to gain business advantages. If he's back, it's not by accident. The use of her full name struck her. Formal, controlled. A wall she hadn't felt between them in weeks. I can handle Matthew, she said. I'm not questioning your ability, he replied, voice measured.
I'm questioning his motives, her pulse raced.
She wanted to reach across the distance, to make him see she wasn't that naive girl Matthew once hurt. But something about the way Delvin stood, shoulders stiff, expression guarded, told her this wasn't just jealousy. It was something deeper. Control, strategy, fear of vulnerability. I need to get back to work, she said finally, turning away before the conversation could fracture further. Camellia, he called after her. She paused, back still to him. Just be careful, he said quietly. She nodded without looking back. That night, as she walked through the snowy streets toward her apartment, the city lights blurred around her. Matthew's reappearance was like a stone thrown into still water, old emotions rippling to the surface. Once he had been everything, charm, excitement, danger. And then he'd broken her trust in the cruelest way, walking away when her world had begun to unravel. She'd built walls after that. Walls Delvin had slowly, unknowingly, been dismantling. And now both men occupied the same orbit. Inside her apartment, she leaned against the door, exhaling shakily. She could feel the old fault lines beneath her carefully laid foundation, threatening to crack open. She didn't know it yet, but Matthew's return was only the beginning. The following evening, Camellia stood in front of the gilded doors of the Langford Hotel ballroom, clutching her portfolio tighter than she intended. The space beyond those doors wasn't just another industry gathering, it was the winter gala hosted by the Midtown Developers Association. For Delvin, it was a networking battlefield. For her, it was both an opportunity and a trap. She had been invited as a guest of Reed Enterprises. A seat at Delvin's private table was no small gesture. It meant she wasn't just a contractor anymore. She was someone worth being seen beside him. And yet, the moment she arrived, her stomach knotted. All around her, women in shimmering gowns glided across marble floors, champagne flutes glinting beneath chandeliers. The men wore tailored tuxedos, laughter clipped and smooth, conversations sharp as negotiations. This world had always intimidated her. But tonight it felt different. It wasn't just intimidation. It was scrutiny. Camellia, her name rolled off his tongue like a promise. She turned to see Delvin walking toward her through the lobby, impossibly composed in a black tuxedo that fit him like armor. His presence seemed to part the crowd. He reached her side, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back.
A subtle, proprietary gesture. You look beautiful, he said simply. She managed a small smile. You clean up well yourself. His eyes softened for a heartbeat.
Ready? As I'll ever be. They stepped through the doors together, greeted by the hum of music and the glint of crystal. Almost immediately heads turned. Whispers followed them like ripples in water. She wasn't just anyone on his arm. She was the designer behind the Harrington Project, a rising name in the industry, and, more dangerously, the woman walking beside Delvin Reed. They took their seats at the central table. Across from them were investors, developers, and Delvin's key executives. Camellia answered questions politely, spoke about design philosophies, and kept her hands folded on her lap. Delvin occasionally glanced at her between conversations, as if silently checking that she was okay. Then midway through dinner, a familiar voice cut through the din. Well,
if it isn't the couple of the season, her pulse skipped.
She didn't even have to turn to know Matthew. He approached with that same effortless confidence, a glass of champagne in hand, wearing a tuxedo like he was born in it. His smile was too smooth. Delvin, good to see you again. Cam? He leaned slightly toward her, not enough to touch, but enough to unsettle. Delvin's expression remained unreadable.
Matthew? I didn't realize you'd be hosting the gala this year, Matthew continued, pulling up a chair at the next table, but turning his body toward theirs.
I suppose it makes sense. Reed Enterprises does love to make a statement. We're not hosting, Delvin said evenly. We're sponsoring. Of course you are, Matthew replied, tone light but edged. His eyes shifted to Camellia.
And you're certainly moving up in the world.
Last time I saw you, you were sketching in that tiny studio on Orchard Street. Look at you now. The words were innocuous on the surface, but the implications stung. Look at you now, riding someone else's coattails, Camellia stiffened. I got here on my own merit, Matthew. He lifted his glass. Naturally. Delvin's hand found hers beneath the table, steady and warm. She didn't realize how tense she was until that moment. Matthew turned his attention to Delvin. I heard Reed Enterprises is eyeing the Halbrook building.
That's quite a leap.
You're planning on making Midtown your empire? Delvin's smile didn't reach his eyes. I don't discuss acquisitions at social events. Ah, Matthew said with a knowing grin, aiming your cards close. I respect that. The conversation drifted, but Matthew stayed close the entire evening, appearing in every circle they entered. He introduced himself to Delvin's executives like he belonged, dropped subtle remarks about his history with Camellia, and watched her reactions carefully. By the time dessert was served, her nerves were frayed. On their way to the balcony for some air, Delvin spoke under his breath. He's baiting you. I know, she replied softly. Don't let him. He thrives on reaction. The cold winter air on the balcony hit her like a balm. She leaned against the stone balustrade, inhaling deeply. Below, the city shimmered. This world is exhausting, she murmured. Delvin joined her side. You handled yourself well. She glanced at him. Did I? Because it felt like everyone was waiting for me to slip. He studied her face for a moment. You don't have to prove yourself to them, or to him. But his words, though kind, didn't settle the unease. Because deep down, she did feel like she had to prove herself. To him, to the glittering crowd, to the entire world that whispered behind crystal glasses. Before she could reply, Matthew appeared again. Of course he did, holding 2 fresh glasses of champagne.
I thought I'd find you here, he said smoothly. Cam always loved balconies. Said they made her feel like she was part of the skyline. She froze.
That was something she'd told him years ago. A private memory, now weaponized. Delvin turned toward him, his tone cool. We're having a private conversation. Matthew ignored him and handed her a glass. Old habits die hard, huh? She didn't take it.
Matthew, stop. He raised his brows innocently.
Stop what talking?
Existing.
Delvin stepped forward slightly, not threatening but protective. The air crackled between the two men. This wasn't just a casual rivalry anymore.
It was personal. Matthew's grin widened, like he'd achieved exactly what he wanted.
Relax, Reed. I'm not here to steal your designer. Or
Anything else? He gave Camellia one last look, intense, knowing, before retreating back inside. Silence fell.
Camelia's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Delvin looked at her carefully. Is there something I should know about the two of you? Her breath caught.
I told you we were engaged.
He cheated. That's it. And now he's circling back. Not because of me, she said, sharper than intended. Because of you. Because of this project.
Because he sees leverage. Delvin's jaw tightened. Exactly my point. Something cold slid between them then.
Not anger, not yet, but a quiet, dangerous doubt. For the first time since their relationship began, she saw the wall behind his gaze, the calculating CEO, not the man who'd held her hand in the elevator weeks ago, and for the first time, she wondered if Matthew's insinuations were right. Was she truly Camellia Baker, designer of Harrington? Or was she just another beautiful woman at Delvin Reed's side, temporary, convenient, a passing chapter in his empire-building story? She didn't know the answer.
And that terrified her.
The following week, New York was blanketed in the first heavy snow of the season. The city slowed beneath a soft white silence, but inside the Reed Enterprises boardroom, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Camellia stood at the head of the long glass table, facing a dozen executives and consultants. Behind her, a massive digital screen displayed the final interior layouts for the Harrington lobby. The presentation was her last before construction wrapped completely, a culmination of months of relentless work. And here, she said, pointing to the central installation rendering, the light sculpture serves as both a focal point and a symbol. It draws people upward, creating a sense of expansion, almost like the building is breathing. It's meant to mirror the city itself, ambitious, ever-reaching. She clicked through the final slides. Her voice was steady, her movements precise, but beneath the surface her heart was elsewhere. Matthew's words on the balcony, Delvin's distant gaze afterward, the quiet in the car ride home that night, no argument, no explanation, just silence. And that concludes the presentation, she finished, lowering the remote. For a beat, the room was still. Then applause broke out, genuine and warm. Several board members exchanged impressed glances. One of the senior consultants leaned toward Delvin, who sat at the far end of the table, and murmured something with a nod toward her. He gave a small smile and clapped with the others, but it was polite, restrained. Gone was the subtle warmth that used to light his eyes whenever he looked at her during these meetings. "Excellent work, Ms. Baker," one of the executives said. "This is going to put Harrington on the map." "Thank you," she replied, forcing a smile. After the meeting, people crowded around her with congratulations, handshakes, and a few probing questions about future collaborations. She answered automatically, though her attention kept drifting to the far end of the room where Delvin spoke with his COO. He didn't approach her afterward. He didn't even look back when he left. That evening, she returned to her apartment exhausted but restless. She paced between the kitchen and the large windows overlooking the snowy street below. Her phone sat on the counter, screen blank. She'd expected him to call,
or at least text, something. Instead, silence. She opened their chat thread.
The last message from him was 2 days ago. Meeting pushed to 4 p.m. I'll pick you up after. That had been before the gala. Before Matthew. She locked the screen again, frustrated with herself. She wasn't a teenager waiting by the phone. She had a career, a reputation. She had just impressed some of the top developers in the city. So why did his silence sting more than any criticism? Her intercom buzzed, suddenly startling her. "Camellia Baker." A familiar voice crackled through. "Delivery," she frowned. She hadn't ordered anything. But when she went downstairs, there he was, Matthew, standing inside the lobby like he belonged there, holding a paper bag that smelled like her favorite Thai takeout. Thought you might be too busy to cook, he said, with an easy smile. Her first instinct was to tell him to leave, but something about the way the cold air clung to his coat and the smell of food hit her reminded her how empty her apartment felt lately. Against her better judgment, she exhaled and let him in. "I don't know why I'm letting you do this," she muttered as they rode the elevator. "Because you're hungry," he replied lightly, "and because deep down you know I'm not here to bite." That's debatable. Inside, they sat across from each other at her small dining table. He unpacked the food like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I watched your presentation online," he said casually. "Harrington's board streams for investors," she raised a brow. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because I still know how brilliant you are." "Matthew." He leaned back. "Fine, because Reed Holdings is involved and I like to keep an eye on my competition." She rolled her eyes. "There it is," but his smile softened. "Seriously, Cam, you were incredible, confident, sharp. That room was eating out of your hand." For a moment, she felt the old familiarity between them, before betrayal, before heartbreak. It was unsettling. "Delvin must be proud," he added, watching her reaction carefully. She hesitated.
"He hasn't said much." Matthew's brows lifted.
"Really? That's
surprising. A guy like him, I'd think he'd be parading you around as the woman who made Harrington sparkle." Her stomach tightened.
It's not like that, isn't it?" His voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. "Cam, look around. You're designing for his company. You're sitting at his table at galas. You're walking into his boardrooms. You're in his world. Do you really think people separate you from him?" She swallowed.
"I earned that contract." "I know you did," he said quickly.
"You're brilliant, but they don't see that."
"And I wonder if he does." She pushed back her chair abruptly.
"Stop," he raised his hands. "I'm not trying to upset you.
"I'm just saying."
Be careful. Delvin Reed isn't a man who lets things happen by accident." She stared at him, anger and doubt tangled inside her. "You have no right to talk about him." Matthew's gaze softened.
"I'm talking about you. I made the mistake of taking you for granted once."
"Don't let someone else do the same." Silence stretched between them. Outside, snow kept falling. Later that night, alone in bed, Camellia lay awake staring at the ceiling. She told herself Matthew was manipulating her, that his words were meant to wedge himself back into her life. And yet, parts of what he said echoed too close to the truth she feared. She thought about Delvin's calculating silence during the board meeting, about the way he'd observed Matthew at the gala, not jealous, but strategic, about how easy it would be for him to compartmentalize her as designer, as woman, as asset. And for the first time, doubt rooted itself deep. Was their connection real or just convenient timing? She turned on her side, pulling the blanket tight, wishing, against her better judgment, that Delvin would just call. Just say something real, but the phone stayed dark, and the silence stretched like a chasm between them. By the time the Harrington lobby's final installation was completed, New York was a frozen jewel under December's relentless wind. The grand atrium now shimmered with finished marble, light sculptures, and glass railings polished to perfection. Reporters and investors circled like hawks, sensing the upcoming inauguration would be a spectacle. For Camellia, it should have been the most triumphant moment of her career. Instead, an invisible weight pressed on her chest. She hadn't spoken properly to Delvin in over a week. They'd crossed paths in meetings, shared polite nods, brief work-related exchanges. But the warmth, the quiet understanding that had bloomed between them, was gone, replaced by formality so sharp it cut. And then came the email. Subject: Change in presentation lead. Harrington opening. From Delvin Reed to Camellia Baker Camellia. Due to recent media interest and investor attendance, I'll be taking the lead on the Harrington opening presentation next week. You will, of course, be acknowledged as lead designer. She reread it 3 times, her hands trembling. She wasn't just acknowledged, she had built this project. Every design decision bore her signature. And now, days before the opening, he was quietly moving her aside. Her phone buzzed. A text from Matthew. Saw the press release.
He's front and center. You okay?
She didn't reply, but her stomach twisted. The confrontation happened that night, at the Harrington site. She found him in the atrium, alone, reviewing lighting angles with a clipboard in hand. He looked immaculate in his long black coat, as if even construction dust bowed to his presence. The light from the chandeliers haloed him, casting a faint glow on his sharp profile. "Delvin," she called. He turned, surprised but composed. "Camellia." Her heart clenched at how formal her name sounded on his lips. "I got your email," she said, walking toward him.
You're taking over the presentation?
He lowered the clipboard. "Given the number of investors and press attending, it's strategic. It'll give the project more weight." "More weight," she repeated slowly.
Or more you?
His expression didn't change.
This isn't personal. Feels personal, she shot back.
"This is my design, my vision. I've worked for months, years, to build something worth standing behind."
And now, days before it all comes together, you push me aside with an email.
Delvin's gaze sharpened. "No one's pushing you aside."
You'll be acknowledged. I don't want to be acknowledged, Delvin, she cut in.
"I want to be seen." The words hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. But it was quickly masked. "This is about optics. Investors respond to me."
That's just reality, she laughed bitterly.
"Right. Reality. The billionaire CEO takes the spotlight, and the designer gets a polite mention at the end." He stepped forward slightly.
Don't twist this. I'm not twisting anything.
Her voice cracked under the weight of bottled emotion. "You made me believe I mattered, Delvin."
Not just my work, me.
"You were there in that elevator when everything started, remember? You told me you saw something in me no one else had. And now you're treating me like a line item in a press release." His jaw tightened.
You're emotional. Her chest burned.
"And you're hiding. Behind strategy. Behind investor language. Behind that damn calm mask you wear like armor." He stared at her, silent. "Say something real," she whispered. For once, a long beat passed. Then finally he said, "Matthew is circling you, Camellia. The press has started speculating. Investors are asking questions. If this presentation becomes about us, it undermines everything."
I need control over the narrative, she froze. So this isn't about my competence. It's about optics.
"About you needing to keep your perfect image intact, I'm protecting the project," he said firmly. "No," she whispered. "You're protecting yourself." For the first time since she'd met him, his composure cracked. Not entirely, but enough for her to glimpse the man underneath.
You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Every headline, every handshake, everything I do affects thousands of people, billions in investments. I can't afford distractions. Distractions, she repeated, voice breaking.
"That's what I am to you," he inhaled sharply.
That's not what I meant. But that's what you said. Silence, heavy, unforgiving. She took a shaky step back. I thought we were building something real. We were, he said softly.
"Almost too softly, were," she echoed. Past tense, the air between them turned cold. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall here, not in front of the chandeliers she'd designed, not under the gaze of the man who suddenly felt like a stranger. She straightened her shoulders. "Good luck with your presentation, Mr. Reed." And with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. She didn't look back. Delvin stood alone in the golden atrium, clipboard forgotten in his hand. For once, the flawless architecture around him felt hollow. That night, back at her apartment, Camellia packed away her presentation notes. She shoved them into a drawer, as if erasing her role could dull the ache.
Outside, snow fell in thick, soundless sheets.
She stared at the window, her reflection fractured against the dark. Her phone buzzed again.
Another message from Matthew, I told you. He'll always choose the empire over the woman. She didn't answer.
But deep down, the doubt that had been seeded was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. For the first time since meeting Delvin, she wondered if walking away might hurt less than staying. The night before the Harrington opening, Manhattan glittered beneath a midnight sky. From the penthouse balcony of the Harrington Tower, the city stretched endlessly, bridges strung with lights like celestial threads, streets pulsing with holiday life. Inside, however, Delvin's world felt suffocatingly still. He stood alone in the living room, the cityscape behind him framed like a painting through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His tailored black shirt hung loose at the collar, his tie abandoned on the couch. For once he didn't look like the unshakable CEO. He looked like a man carrying too many unsaid words. His team had finished rehearsals hours ago. Investors were flying in. Everything was ready. On paper, tomorrow would be perfect, and yet Camelia's absence echoed louder than any investor applause ever could. He tried working, reviewing seating charts, media angles, security protocols, but every bullet point blurred into the memory of her voice in the atrium, trembling yet fierce. "I want to be seen." Those words had lodged themselves in his chest like glass shards. He poured himself a drink. The whiskey burned down his throat, but it didn't quiet the unrest. He walked toward the window, watching the snowfall begin again, gentle, relentless. It reminded him of that first night in the elevator when everything between them had been raw and unscripted. How had they gone from that electric honesty to this? Meanwhile, across the river, Camelia sat cross-legged on the floor of her small apartment, surrounded by presentation boards, sketchbooks, and models she couldn't bring herself to pack away completely. Her laptop played some old jazz tune she wasn't really listening to. Her phone lit up. One new notification. A news headline in "Read to Lead Grand Harrington Presentation. Project promises to redefine Midtown skyline." The photo was of him on the site balcony earlier that day, sharp suit, hands in pockets, the city his backdrop. He looked untouchable, commanding, exactly the man investors worshipped. She closed the laptop. Her hands trembled, not from anger this time, but from the quiet ache of knowing she still loved him. That truth sat heavy, inconvenient, inescapable. She tried telling herself this was professional, that she was hurt because of the project. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. It was him. The way he'd looked at her in stolen moments, as if the world outside didn't exist. The warmth that had bloomed despite their differences, and the way he'd called her a distraction. Her chest tightened. Tears pricked at her eyes. She grabbed her coat. She wasn't sure what drove her out into the snowy night. Maybe closure. Maybe defiance. Maybe the fragile hope that something, anything between them, was still salvageable. When the elevator doors opened to Delvin's penthouse, he didn't expect to see her. But there she was, Camelia, standing hesitantly at the threshold, snow dusting her hair like fragile stars. "Camelia," he breathed, his voice low. "Hi," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She hugged her coat tighter around herself.
"I know it's late." His pulse quickened. "No, it's fine."
"Come in." She stepped inside slowly, her boots leaving melting footprints on the polished floor. The warmth of the penthouse enveloped her, contrasting the cold, swirling outside. She glanced around. Everything was perfectly in place, just like him. Except him. He looked tired. Not in the way long workdays made someone tired, but in the way someone looked when holding too much inside for too long. "Tomorrow's the big day," she said softly. He nodded. "It is." Silence stretched between them, filled with everything neither had said since the argument. Finally, she exhaled.
"I wasn't going to come. I told myself I was done."
"That you'd made your choice." He stepped closer.
"And yet you're here." Her eyes glistened. "'Cause part of me hoped."
Maybe I got it wrong. He clenched his jaw, emotions warring behind his gaze. You didn't get it wrong. Her breath caught. Then why?
Why did you push me away like that?
Delvin turned toward the window, hands braced against the glass. The city lights reflected across his face like fractured stars. Because the world I live in doesn't forgive weakness.
It doesn't forgive distractions. Every decision I make is scrutinized, weaponized. I thought keeping you out of the spotlight would protect both of us. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away.
I never asked to be protected.
I asked to be trusted. His shoulders stiffened. I can fight, she continued, stepping closer. I've fought my whole life, Delvin. I built everything I have from nothing.
But when it came to us, you didn't even give me the chance to stand beside you. You just decided for me. He turned, finally meeting her eyes. And for the first time, the steel in his gaze cracked, revealing raw vulnerability beneath. Because I'm terrified, Camellia.
I've never let anyone close enough to matter. Not since my father died.
Not since every partnership I trusted turned into betrayal. You got under my skin and I didn't know how to handle it. The confession landed like a shockwave. She stared at him, heartbeat hammering. You think you're the only one who's scared? She whispered.
I was terrified every single day working next to you. 'Cause you... And still I showed up. I stood my ground.
Because what we were building, this project, us, it mattered. Delvin took a step toward her. It still matters, does it? She challenged, her voice breaking. Or are we just pretending this was something it never really was? His chest rose and fell, uneven. No pretending. I tried to bury it under strategy and headlines, but I can't. I can't stop thinking about you, Camellia.
Even when I should. The honesty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine.
For a heartbeat, the distance between them dissolved, leaving only two people standing in a storm of their own making. But a reality crept back in, sharp and unforgiving.
Tomorrow, she whispered.
You'll stand on that stage alone. His gaze softened. Unless you choose to stand with me, she froze. Be there tomorrow, he said quietly.
Not just as the designer, as you. Beside me, her breath hitched.
Hope flared, fragile and dangerous. She wasn't sure if she could trust it yet. But for the first time since their fight, she saw the man who had once looked at her in that broken elevator. Not the CEO, but the man. She nodded faintly. We'll see. And with that she turned to leave, snow swirling in behind her as the elevator doors slid shut. Delvin remained by the window long after she was gone, his reflection staring back at him. For once, the city didn't feel like his kingdom. It felt like the edge of something he might lose. Morning sunlight spilled over Manhattan like gold leaf, catching on the glass facade of the newly completed Harrington Tower. It was the day everyone had been waiting for. Months of planning, endless revisions, sleepless nights, and whispered doubts had all led to this moment. On the plaza outside, reporters crowded behind barricades, cameras flashing like 1,000 tiny storms. Banners with the Harrington logo fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze. Luxury cars pulled up one after another, releasing waves of donors, city officials, celebrities, and executives in dark suits and polished shoes. A string quartet played softly near the fountain, their music blending with the hum of conversation. Inside, the main lobby gleamed like a cathedral of glass and steel. Giant floral arrangements lined the entrance, while delicate light fixtures cast a warm, golden glow on the polished marble floors. Camellia stood just beyond the grand staircase, her heart pounding in rhythm with the sound of heels clicking across the floor. She wore a cream silk blouse tucked into tailored trousers and a structured blazer, professional, elegant, yet unmistakably her. Her hair was swept back, revealing the quiet determination in her eyes. She had spent half the night wrestling with doubt, but when dawn broke over the city, something inside her had clicked into place. This was her work.
Her vision, her fight.
She wouldn't hide anymore. Across the lobby she caught sight of Delvin moving through a sea of guests. In his charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and silver tie, he was the epitome of composed power. Yet, when his eyes found hers across the room, something unspoken passed between them, a steady current that anchored her trembling resolve. He gave a subtle nod, not commanding, inviting. Camellia inhaled slowly and nodded back. The ceremony began outside with the city skyline as the perfect backdrop. The mayor gave a polished speech about innovation, economic growth, and urban legacy. A string of executives followed, each delivering rehearsed lines about vision and transformation. But Camelia's hands only began to sweat when the MC finally announced, "And now, to share the heart behind the Harrington design, please welcome Reed Enterprises CEO, Mr. Delvin Reed, and lead designer, Ms. Camellia Baker." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as her name was spoken. Reporters craned their necks. Some recognized her from past society gossip. Others were curious why a young designer stood beside the formidable Delvin Reed. She walked up the steps beside him, her heels clicking on the temporary stage floor. The podium was shared between them. Delvin leaned slightly toward the microphone first, his voice resonant and calm. "Good morning," he began, surveying the crowd with that effortless authority. "Today marks more than just the opening of a building. Harrington Tower is a symbol of what happens when vision meets courage, when we dare to see beauty in the spaces where others see only structure." He turned slightly, eyes meeting hers in a way that only she could read. And none of this would have been possible without someone who saw beauty where the rest of us saw blueprints. Someone who challenged us, inspired us, and never once compromised her truth. Her breath caught. He extended his hand, not for the mic, but toward her. The gesture was both public and intimate. The crowd watched, expectant. Camellia stepped forward, taking the microphone with a steadier grip than she expected. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear, but threaded with emotion. "When I first walked into the Harrington site, it was just concrete and echoes.
But I saw something alive.
This project isn't just steel and glass. It's a story about resilience, about daring to dream big even when people doubt you." She glanced at Delvin. "Working with this team, with him," her voice softened on that word, "taught me that design isn't about perfection, it's about trust. Trusting the vision, trusting each other." The wind picked up, rustling banners as cameras flashed wildly. She looked out at the sea of faces, not hiding, not shrinking. "I hope Harrington Tower inspires others the way it's inspired me, to take up space."
"To build something that lasts." Applause erupted, warm and genuine.
In that moment, for the first time, Camellia wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. She was standing in her own light. After the ribbon cutting, champagne corks popped, and the crowd moved inside for the official tour. Reporters swarmed around Camellia, asking about her inspirations, her journey, her partnership with Reed Enterprises. She answered each question gracefully, no longer flinching at the mention of Delvin's name beside hers. Near the atrium, she felt a gentle touch on her elbow. She turned, and there he was, out of the spotlight for a stolen moment. Delvin's eyes were soft in a way that no boardroom ever saw. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly, just for her.
"I meant every word." Her pulse quickened.
"So did I." He glanced around. Journalists were still nearby, but then he did something uncharacteristic. He reached for her hand, slowly, openly. She froze for a heartbeat.
Cameras were everywhere, but then...
She laced her fingers through his. The world seemed to hold its breath for a second before the flashes exploded like fireworks. No hiding, no pretending. Later that afternoon, after the ceremony wound down and guests dispersed, Camellia stood alone in the lobby, looking up at the soaring atrium she had designed. The sunlight filtered through the glass, painting everything in golden light. She felt peaceful. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had chosen to stand tall. Despite it all, she heard footsteps approaching. Delvin, his tie was loosened, jacket undone, the polished CEO facade slipping away now that the cameras were gone. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually show up this morning," he admitted softly. She smiled faintly.
Neither was I. He stepped closer. Camellia.
"Last night when I asked you to stand beside me, I wasn't just talking about the stage." Her heart fluttered.
I know, and
She met his gaze steadily. "And I'm here, aren't I?" His lips curved, small, genuine, almost boyish. He reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear with surprising tenderness. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he murmured. She exhaled, something deep inside finally loosening. "Neither do I." And right there, in the golden light of the building they built together, Delvin kissed her, not as a CEO claiming victory, but as a man choosing love in front of the world. 6 months later, spring had settled over New York, washing the city in soft light and new blooms. Madison Square Park was alive with the sound of street musicians, couples strolling hand in hand, and children chasing bubbles through the air. The harsh winds of winter had faded, replaced by warm breezes carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms and food trucks brewing coffee. Camellia walked briskly through the park, heels clicking against the cobblestone path. She wore a pale blue trench coat, the belt cinched at her waist, and her hair tied in a loose knot that caught the morning light. Her phone buzzed non-stop, emails from clients, press requests, invitations to speak at design conferences. 6 months ago, she'd been fighting to prove herself. Now the name Camellia Baker was whispered in design circles with admiration and a touch of awe. Harrington had not only been a professional triumph, it had launched her into an entirely new realm. Her studio had doubled in size. She'd signed 2 new landmark projects. Magazines called her the fresh voice of modern New York design. But amidst all the chaos, her favorite moments were the quiet ones. Late nights sketching beside Delvin, Sunday mornings spent cooking pancakes in his penthouse kitchen, the way his hand always found hers in crowded rooms without hesitation. As she neared the corner of the park, she saw him before he saw her. Delvin was leaning casually against a black car, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, looking far too effortlessly handsome for a weekday morning. A few passers-by glanced his way, recognizing him as that Delvin Reed, the billionaire CEO, but Camellia no longer felt like a stranger in his world. She was a part of it now, not as a decoration, but as herself. "You're early?" she teased, approaching him. He straightened, that rare, soft smile tugging at his lips.
I had a meeting, but I cancelled it. Her brows lifted.
Delvin Reed cancelled a meeting? "For you," he said simply, taking her hand and pressing a quick kiss to her knuckles. His tone was light, but his eyes held a spark of something deeper. She laughed softly. "Well, I'm honored."
Where are we going?
"You'll see." The car wound through the city and eventually crossed into the Hudson Valley. As skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills and vineyards, Camellia leaned against the window, watching the scenery change with growing curiosity. "Are you secretly kidnapping me?"
She asked, half joking. Would you fight back?
He countered, smirking. "Depends on where we end up." He didn't answer, but when they finally stopped, her breath caught. Before them stood a grand 19th century estate overlooking the river, its stone facade wrapped in ivy, surrounded by blooming gardens. A place that looked suspended between time and dream. "Delvin," she breathed. He stepped out and offered her his hand. "Come on." They wandered through the gardens, past rose bushes just beginning to bloom, and fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. Camellia found herself falling into a rare, quiet peace. For so long, her life had been about chasing, proving, surviving. Now she allowed herself to walk beside him without needing to look over her shoulder. "This place is beautiful," she said, softly. "It belonged to the Harrington family once," he explained. "They used to host galas here a century ago."
I bought it last year, but it never felt like the right time to show anyone. She stopped, studying him.
Why now? He met her gaze steadily. Because now, it does. They reached the edge of the property, where a stone terrace overlooked the Hudson River. The water shimmered like molten glass under the afternoon sun. A small table was set there, linen cloth, crystal flutes, and a single bottle of champagne chilling in a silver bucket. Camellia raised an eyebrow. "You've been planning something," Delvin shrugged, but the faint nervousness in his eyes betrayed him. It was rare, almost shocking to see him anything other than perfectly controlled. It made her heart skip. He gestured for her to sit. When they both settled, he poured the champagne, but his hands weren't quite as steady as usual. She watched him, curious and warm all at once. "You've been different lately," she said, teasing gently. "Almost human," he chuckled. "Don't tell the board." They'd panic, then his smile faded into something more serious.
"Camellia, these past 6 months."
"I've stood in front of more cameras, investors, and critics than I can count. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals. I've fought for projects I believed in, but nothing has challenged me or changed me the way you have." Her heart tightened, in the best way. "I used to think love was a liability," he continued, "something that made you vulnerable, weak. But with you, it's been the opposite. You made me see strength where I thought there was risk. You made me want more than just power." The air shifted. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and when his hand emerged, her breath caught entirely a small, elegant velvet box. "Delvin?" she whispered. He rose from his chair, moving to kneel in front of her on the sun-warmed stone terrace. The river glimmered behind him like a witness. "This isn't about the press or appearances," he said softly. "It's about the woman who grabbed my hand at a gala when she was terrified and somehow ended up grabbing my heart in the process. It's about building something lasting together." He opened the box to reveal a ring unlike anything she'd expected. A vintage cushion-cut diamond set in a delicate platinum band, its design timeless, echoing the elegance of another era. "Camellia Baker," he said, his voice low and steady. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the river, the sky, everything but him. Her hands flew to her mouth as a laugh broke through, a laugh of disbelief. "Joy, release, yes," she whispered. Then louder, trembling and radiant, "Yes, of course I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands warm against her skin. When he rose, she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest as laughter and tears mingled in the breeze. The champagne flutes caught the light as if celebrating with them. The river kept flowing, and in that quiet corner of the world, away from flashing cameras and boardrooms, their story found its next beginning. They lingered on the terrace as the river darkened into a ribbon of reflected lights. The champagne had gone warm in its silver bucket, and the estate around them had folded into a hush. After months of schedules and headlines, they allowed themselves a deliberate, slow hour. To laugh, to plan, to sit in the simplest silence. Delvin watched Camellia as if cataloguing something precious. The ring on her finger caught the last sun. He kept thinking of the impulsive gesture in the ballroom months ago that had led to this impossible sequence. Now gravity felt private and necessary, and it made him careful in ways spreadsheets never had. On the drive back to the city, a terse message from his assistant sat unread on the console. "Board congratulates. PR drafting release. Availability tomorrow?" And he buried the phone under his hand. They had both felt the prick of old anxieties, how quickly a private thing could be repurposed into a story. So they made a pact that evening. Tell only a few people, ask for discretion, let the news be a human thing before it became a headline. They kept that promise at first. Delvin sent a short note to his closest partner, keeping this private for now, and Camellia asked her studio manager to accept client messages but not to schedule interviews. They hosted a modest dinner for the Harrington core team and a handful of family members, not a public spectacle, just cake, toasts, and laughter that felt sealed from the wider world. The evening settled into both of them as proof that their life could exist in small circles. Still, the world intruded in small, practical ways. A misrouted press note and a stray group text fed a brief rumor. A columnist's offhand remark about influence prompted one of Delvin's executives to make a cautious call. Each intrusion became the subject of a quiet conversation about boundaries, about what to say publicly, and about how to manage roles without erasing private selves. They stumbled, they learned, and the repair always started with both of them speaking in the same room. Work kept them steady. Camelia's studio accepted projects that felt like honest next steps, 2 new commissions, small commercial interiors that played to her strengths. Reviews arrived in careful clusters, treating her voice as design leadership rather than gossip. Reed Enterprises continued with measured choices. Observers noted a pattern of stewardship rather than spectacle. Those outcomes eased some of the outside chatter. The best rebuttal was the work itself. At home, the negotiation of a life together took on domestic scales. Delvin learned to protect without patronizing, rerouting a call whose timing would have derailed her day, composing an email to a supplier in neutral tones so she could return to a sketch. Camelia learned to accept help, delegating errands, trusting an assistant to rearrange a meeting slot, small lifts that freed time for design. They invented tiny rituals, a shared grocery list, a playlist for long drives, a rule to end the day with one sentence of gratitude. They did not rush a wedding. Dates were floated, tabled, floated again. They wanted to practice being we, to test the seams on ordinary days before staging a ceremony. That decision felt deliberate. They would let privacy be a buffer while intimacy settled. Inevitably, there were missteps. An over-enthusiastic contractor mentioned the engagement at a public meeting. A photograph from a closed rehearsal leaked. Each slip required immediate, practical repair, a direct message, a clarification, a tightened protocol for who could speak externally. The episodes were jarring but not catastrophic. Each time, they returned to the same routine of repair and conversation, and each return made the seams sturdier. Months passed and small public moments accumulated into a gentler narrative. Camelia's name began appearing in features that discussed materiality and the quiet courage of human-centered spaces. At a modest gallery opening for one of her editorial projects, critics praised the warmth of her approach. Delvin stood nearby, his smile finding hers and staying there in long, unguarded moments. People who had once whispered now offered congratulations that felt finally unself-conscious. They learned to handle the press not by shielding entirely, but by choosing how and when to speak. When the announcement finally went out, their statement was simple. Delvin Reed and Camelia Baker are engaged. They request privacy as they begin their life together. The wording shaped the reception. Some columns still snapped at questions of optics. More often, coverage emphasized collaboration and stewardship. The politicians and pundits growled. News would always find edges, but such noise felt less decisive than the drafts and models and meetings they kept making. In the quiet rooms of their shared life, trust was built from ordinary acts. Delvin left a steaming mug on her drafting table on a rain-soaked morning. Camelia texted him an image of a fabric sample and asked, "Does this read warm at dusk?" He attended a pro bono community meeting because she wanted to hear what neighbors thought of the public courtyard. Those small alignments mattered more than any headline. They lived not in triumph, but in iterations. An argument over calendars led to a new, shared calendar protocol. A misread email taught them to read tone before reacting. They apologized. They tried again. The ritual of repair, swift, earnest, and without theatrical displays, became the scaffolding of their partnership. On an ordinary late summer night, they sat on their couch while the skyline melted into indigo. Camellia rested her head on Delvin's shoulder. He slipped his fingers into hers and felt, in that small clasp, a steadiness that had been hard won. The ring at her knuckle flashed in lamplight like a quiet punctuation mark, an everyday reminder of a choice they had made together. There was no sudden perfection, no cinematic final act. There was a life accrued in small decisions, where to hang a chair, whether to adopt a dog, how to answer a late-night media query. It was imperfect and ongoing, built by two people who had practiced humility and the daily labor of paying attention. They had chosen to build deliberately. That decision, more than any announcement or gala, was the thing that would hold them steady.